Ancient Rome, the price of pleasure was your very existence. You are in a darkened room off the Suburra, the scent of cheap wine, sweat, and oil thick in the air. The man before you is a senator's son, his breath hot on your neck. It is the role you play in this moment, not the act itself, that will determine your future. You are a citizen, freeborn and proud, but in the next few minutes, you can choose a path that will render you legally invisible, a ghost in your own city. His hands are on you, and with every touch, you can feel the weight of the forum, the courts, and the entire social order pressing down, waiting for your decision. In the Roman Republic, and later the Empire, the concept of homosexuality, as we understand it, did not exist. The moral and legal axis was not gender but power, codified in the brutal binary of penetration. You were either the active, dominant partner or the passive, submissive one. For a Roman citizen, a civis Romanus, to voluntarily assume the passive role in a same-sex encounter was a catastrophic breach of civic identity. It was to willingly become a woman, a slave, an object. The act was called stuprum, but the real crime was the surrender of virtus, the masculine essence that entitled a man to his rights, his voice, and his very personhood. This wasn't a sin to be confessed in private. It was a public declaration of unsuitability for Roman life. The taboo was not enshrined in a single, overarching law against the act, but in a web of social and legal consequences known as infamia. A man declared infamous was socially and legally neutered. He could not vote in assemblies, hold public office, or command legions. More devastatingly, his testimony was inadmissible in court. He could be robbed, beaten, or cheated, and he would have no legal recourse, his voice silenced by the state. He became a non-person, occupying the same legal category as prostitutes, meretresses, actors, and gladiators, people who sold or surrendered control of their bodies and were thus considered fundamentally untrustworthy. The poet Catullus could write graphically about his sexual desires, but he always positioned himself as the dominant force, a key distinction that preserved his honor. Imagine the moment of accusation. It would not come from a priest, but from a political rival in the forum or a lawyer in a courtroom. The charge, often leveled with theatrical scorn, was that you were a Sinitus or a Pathicus, words spat like venom. There was no need for witnesses to the act itself. Your perceived effeminacy, your gait, your tone of voice, or your association with known passive men could be enough to sow the doubt. Your enemy would paint a picture of you on your back, not as a lover, but as a conquered territory. The jury would not be weighing evidence of a crime, but judging the quality of your Roman masculinity. The heat in the courtroom would be stifling, the eyes of every citizen dissecting your posture, your every nervous twitch of confession. The punishment was not a lashing or a fine, but a slow, public erasure. Once branded with infamia, your name was struck from the lists of respectable citizens. Friends would cross the street to avoid you. Business partners would dissolve contracts. Your own family might disown you to preserve their own standing. You would walk through the same streets, see the same temples, but you would be a phantom. The great, grinding machinery of Roman law and commerce would simply roll over you as if you were not there. This was not a physical death, but a civic one, a sentence to live out your days as a walking specter, a testament to the fact that in Rome, your body was never truly your own. It was a property of the state. The horror of the Roman taboo was its chillingly practical nature. It wasn't about saving your soul. It was about preserving the empire's power structure. The state didn't care who you loved or desired. It only cared that you never, ever willingly placed yourself in the position of the conquered. It was a system that conflated sexual submission with political treason, turning a moment of private intimacy into an act that could dismantle a man's entire world. In Rome, your orgasm did not have to be witnessed by God, only by the state, and it judged you accordingly. The ultimate taboo was not the sex act, but the loss of control. Medieval Europe, your very dreams were evidence of a demonic assault. You wake in a cold sweat, the straw mattress scratching your back. The darkness of your wattle and daub hut is absolute, but the images from your sleep are seared onto the back of your eyelids. It was a dream of pleasure, vivid and carnal, a phantom lover whose touch felt more real than the coarse wool of your blanket. But as your mind clears, a different feeling rises, not lingering arousal, but ice-cold terror. Was it just a dream? Or was it a pollutio nocturna, a nocturnal pollution, a visitation from succubus sent from hell to steal your seed and your soul? The rooster has not yet crowed, but you know you must rise and find the priest. The sin has already been committed in the theater of your mind, and now penance is your only hope. Across medieval Christendom, the Church's dominion extended into the most private spaces imaginable, the marital bed and the subconscious mind. Guided by the writings of theologians like Augustine of Hippo, who saw sexual desire, concupiscentia, as a direct, corrupting consequence of Adam and Eve's original sin, the act of sex was viewed with profound suspicion. Even within the sacrament of marriage, it was a dangerous necessity, a grim duty to be performed for procreation only. To experience pleasure during the act was to flirt with sin. To actively seek, it was to court damnation. This theological framework created a universe of sexual taboos that were both deeply invasive and psychologically ruinous, policed not by soldiers, but by priests armed with terrifyingly specific manuals. These were the penitentials, handbooks for confessors that emerged in the early Middle Ages. They were catalogs of human frailty, listing every conceivable sexual act and assigning a precise tariff of penance. These were not vague warnings against lust, but clinical, granular lists. The Penitential of Theodore, for example, prescribed 1 year of penance for oral sex and 7 years for anal sex between a husband and wife, classifying them as unnatural acts that frustrated God's procreative design. Fornication might earn you a year of fasting on bread and water. Adultery, 7 years. The act of masturbation, a solitary sin, was treated with particular horror, seen as a sterile spilling of the seed God intended for life, earning the penitent months or even years of prayer and deprivation. Imagine the confession. You are kneeling in the damp chill of a stone church, the smell of beeswax and incense heavy in the air. You whisper your transgressions through the screen to a shadowy figure whose face you cannot see. You must be specific. It is not enough to say you have been lustful. The priest, guided by his penitential, will press for details. Did you perform the act on a Sunday? During Lent? On a feast day? Was your wife menstruating or pregnant? Each detail adds another layer of sin, another week or month to your sentence of penance. The process was designed to be humiliating, to strip away your privacy and expose your most intimate moments to the judgment of God's earthly representative. The shame was a tool meant to scour the soul clean. The enforcement of these taboos went beyond the confessional. The belief in incubi, male demons, and succubi, female demons, who visited mortals in their sleep to seduce them and steal their life force was not a fringe superstition. It was a theological reality. A nocturnal emission was not a biological function, but potential evidence of a demonic pact. The Malleus Maleficarum, the infamous late medieval witch-hunting manual, would later devote entire chapters to how witches, in league with demons, could cause impotence, illicit passions, or sterile unions. An accusation of sexual witchcraft could lead you from the confessional to the torture chamber, where the line between private sin and public heresy was erased with hot irons and the rack. The political and social consequences were devastating. A lord whose wife was barren could, under the guise of piety, accuse her of witchcraft stemming from some sexual sin to have the marriage annulled. A rival could spread rumors that a man was impotent due to a demonic curse, ruining his reputation and social standing. The Church's obsession with sexual purity gave immense power to the clergy and created a society saturated with paranoia and guilt. Every natural impulse was a potential gateway for demonic influence, and every neighbor was a potential witness to your fall from grace. The system turned everyone into the Aztec Empire. A single infidelity was a debt paid in blood. The dust of the marketplace floor is gritty against your cheek. Your arms are bound so tightly with maguey fiber that your fingers have gone numb. The sound is overwhelming. A chorus of jeers and insults from the crowd that has gathered, the faces of your neighbors twisted in righteous fury. Next to you, he is bound too, his face a mask of terror. You both knew the law. You knew the price. But in stolen moments in the shadow of a maize field, that knowledge had seemed distant, unreal. Now it is terrifyingly present. The first stone strikes your shoulder, a sharp, biting impact that steals your breath. It was not thrown by a priest or a soldier, but by your own brother. In the rigid, highly stratified world of the Aztec Empire, social order was paramount, a sacred duty to maintain the balance of the cosmos. This order was reflected in a legal code of breathtaking severity, where transgressions were seen not just as crimes against individuals, but as insults to the gods that could bring disaster upon the entire community. While their cosmology was filled with powerful, often amoral deities, the laws governing human behavior were ruthlessly puritanical. At the heart of this code was the absolute sanctity of the marital bond. Adultery, or tetlaneliqualisli, was considered one of the most heinous crimes a person could commit, a stain that could only be cleansed with the public, ritualized shedding of blood. The Aztec obsession with sexual purity was deeply ingrained. Virginity before marriage was fetishized, especially for women of the noble class. A bride's family could gain immense honor if she was proven a virgin on her wedding night. A fact sometimes publicly verified, this intense focus on chastity created a society where private desire was a constant, lethal risk. The laws did not discriminate by class in their final judgment. A noblewoman and a commoner faced the same fate, but the methods of execution could vary. The law was codified and taught in the Kalmakak and Telpakali, the schools for noble and commoner children, ensuring that every citizen understood the consequences from a young age. This was not a hidden rule. It was a foundational pillar of their civilization. The process from accusation to execution was swift and brutal. An aggrieved husband had the legal right to bring a charge of adultery against his wife and her lover. The case would be heard by a local court, but the evidence required was often minimal. A credible witness or even strong circumstantial evidence could be enough for a conviction. Once found guilty, the sentence was death. There was no appeal. The condemned pair would be taken to a public place, often the Tainquisli marketplace, to be made an example. The method was prescribed by law, death by stoning. In some cases, particularly if the offenders were of high rank, strangulation with a garrote was used instead, considered a slightly less dishonorable death. The true horror lay in the communal nature of the execution. The law often stipulated that the aggrieved relatives, the husband, the wife's father, her brothers, should cast the first stones. This was a deliberate, psychological mechanism. It transformed a state execution into a personal, familial act of purification, forcing the family to publicly cleanse its own honor by participating in the slaughter. The crowd would then join in, a frenzy of retributive violence. The air would fill with the sickening thud of rock against flesh and bone, the screams of the condemned drowned out by the roar of the mob. It was a spectacle designed to be unforgettable, a visceral lesson etched into the memory of every onlooker. The bodies were often left on display as a final warning. The political dimension of this taboo was immense. It reinforced a patriarchal structure where a woman's body was the property of her husband's lineage. A wife's infidelity was a threat to the purity of his bloodline and an unforgivable insult to his honor. Interestingly, the law was not entirely one-sided in theory. A man could be executed for adultery with another man's wife. However, a man's dalliances with unmarried women or prostitutes carried no such penalty. The system was designed to protect male lineage and property rights, using the female body as the primary site of enforcement. This brutal Puritanism stood in stark contrast to the bloody spectacle of human sacrifice at the Templo Mayor, creating a society where different forms of killing were sanctioned for different purposes. One to appease the gods, the other to enforce human law. In the Aztec world, your desire wasn't a sin. It was a capital crime against the state. The Ottoman Empire, sex was not a crime, but a form of treason. You stand perfectly still, the scent of jasmine and rosewater thick in the air of the harem. Around you, the other women of the harem laugh and gossip, their voices echoing off the marble walls. But your heart is a cold stone in your chest. You have missed your monthly blood. It is only a few days late, but here, in this gilded cage, a few days can be a death sentence. The only man you are permitted to know is the Sultan, a man you have seen only twice from a distance. The father of the life growing inside you is a palace guard, a young man whose face you saw for only a few stolen minutes in a shadowed alcove. You are watched constantly by the Kisler Agassi, the chief black eunuch, his eyes missing nothing. You are not a woman carrying a secret love child. You are a traitor carrying a dynastic bomb. The imperial harem of the Ottoman Empire, housed within the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul, was one of the most rigidly controlled sexual environments ever conceived. It was not merely a royal brothel. It was the heart of the dynasty, a human nursery designed for a single purpose: to produce a male heir for the Sultan and ensure the continuation of the Osman dynasty. Within its walls, the ultimate taboo was any sexual activity that threatened the absolute, singular authority of the Sultan's seed. Every woman inside, from the lowest Kurii concubine to the most powerful Khaden, imperial consort, was his exclusive property. For a woman to have a liaison with any other man was not adultery. It was high treason. For a man to breach the harem's sanctity was to challenge the Sultan's virility and, by extension, his very right to rule. The entire system was built on a foundation of sexual control, physically embodied by the core of eunuchs. These men were slaves, captured in foreign territories and brutally castrated as boys to render them safe guardians. They were divided into two groups: white eunuchs who guarded the outer sections of the palace, and the more powerful black eunuchs, often from Africa, who controlled the harem itself. The chief black eunuch was one of the most powerful officials in the entire empire, a man whose physical mutilation gave him unparalleled access and authority. He was the Sultan's eyes and ears, the enforcer of a suffocating code of conduct where a misplaced glance or a whispered word could be interpreted as a capital offense. The discovery of a forbidden pregnancy was the harem's ultimate crisis. There was no trial. The guilt was self-evident and absolute. The fate of the woman was sealed by an unspoken but ironclad protocol. She would be taken quietly, often at night, by the eunuchs. There would be no public spectacle, no stoning in the marketplace. The harem scandals were not for public consumption. The punishment was known as sack discipline. The condemned woman would be bound, placed alive into a weighted leather sack, and rowed out into the Bosphorus Strait. There, she would be unceremoniously dropped into the cold, dark water, her secret and her life extinguished in silence. It was a clean, quiet solution that left no trace and no inconvenient corpse to be buried. The man involved, if discovered, faced an equally grim, though perhaps swifter, fate. A palace guard, a servant, or even a visiting dignitary caught in a compromising situation would be executed instantly. The method was often decapitation, his head sometimes displayed as a grim warning to others. The system's logic was relentless. Any bloodline other than the Sultan's was a potential threat, a source of rival claimants to the throne that could plunge the empire into civil war. The fear of this dynastic instability was so great that, for a period, a practice known as fratricide was codified into law, allowing a new sultan to execute all his brothers to secure his throne. The harem's sexual taboos were the first line of defense against this chaos. The social and political fallout of such a transgression was contained by the silence of the execution. The woman would simply vanish. She would be recorded as having died of a sudden illness or been discreetly transferred to a distant palace. Her family, if they were even aware of her fate, would dare not ask questions. The harem was a world unto itself, a state within a state, and its laws were absolute. To question them was to question the Sultan. This system created a pressure cooker of intrigue, jealousy, and fear, where women vied for the Sultan's attention not just for power, but for survival. To be overlooked was to be safe. To be noticed was to walk a razor's edge. Here, your womb was not a source of life, but a potential crime scene. Tokugawa, Japan. Your class determined if love was art or a death sentence. The rice paper screen of the tea house is thin, and through it, you can hear the faint music of a shamisen. The older man across from you, a veteran samurai, is explaining the finer points of the tea ceremony, but his gaze lingers on your youthful hands. You are his wakashu, his young protege, and this relationship, this bond of shudo, is more than just mentorship. It is a path of loyalty, aesthetics, and erotic love, celebrated in poetry and art as the purest form of devotion, untainted by the transactional nature of marriage. This love is honorable. It is beautiful. Meanwhile, across the city of Edo, a merchant's wife shares a secret glance with a clerk. For them, the same human impulse is not art. It is a capital crime that will end with a sword in their lover's belly and her own public disgrace and death. Tokugawa, Japan, 1603 to 1868, was a society of rigid hierarchies and meticulously defined social codes, governed by the samurai warrior class under the authority of the shogun. Within this structure, sexual taboos were not universal, but were intricately tied to one's social standing. For the samurai, who valued loyalty, discipline, and martial prowess above all else, the practice of shudo, literally the way of the young, was not only accepted but often idealized. This was a structured, romantic, and often sexual relationship between an older, more experienced samurai, ninja, and an adolescent boy, wakashu. It was seen as a noble bond that strengthened loyalty and taught the younger warrior about aesthetics, honor, and duty. It was considered purer than heterosexual love, which was associated with the messy, domestic, and procreative world of women. This idealized vision of male-male love stood in brutal contrast to the official view of female sexuality, particularly within the merchant and peasant classes. While samurai men were free to engage in shudo and to frequent the licensed pleasure quarters, the ukiyo, or floating world, their own wives were held to an impossibly strict standard of fidelity. For a married woman from any class to commit adultery was the ultimate betrayal. The law, known as megatakiuchi, wife adulterer revenge, gave a husband a legal right to kill his wife and her lover on the spot if he caught them in the act. He faced no legal repercussions for this act of honor killing. It was his right, and in some social circles, his duty. Imagine the terror of discovery. A husband returning home unexpectedly. The frantic whispers, the rustle of clothing. There is no trial, no court, no appeal. The husband's katana, his symbol of status and power, becomes an instrument of justice. He could, by law, cut down the lover first, then his wife. The act was not considered murder. It was the rightful restoration of order and the cleansing of his household's honor. If he chose not to kill them, he could still bring them to the authorities, where the lover would be crucified and the wife executed. The husband who failed to act decisively could himself be shamed for his lack of resolve. The physical act of this justice was gruesome. The husband was not required to be a clean executioner. The killing could be a frenzied, furious affair. Sources from the period describe lovers being cut down in their beds, the scene a bloody tableau of dishonor. The bodies would then be dealt with. Sometimes they were exposed publicly to serve as a warning. The lover's head might be displayed. The woman's family would be irredeemably shamed. The social death was as complete as the physical one. This legal and social framework effectively made a woman's body the property of her husband, her fidelity a matter of his public honor, not her private conscience. The hypocrisy was a cornerstone of the social order. A samurai could compose poetry about the beautiful neck of his wakashu, while a merchant who wrote a love letter to another man's wife was signing both their death warrants. The floating world of the pleasure quarters offered a release valve, with courtesans and male prostitutes available for those who could afford them. But this was a carefully cordoned-off world. It existed to protect the integrity of the family unit, not to liberate individual desire. The taboo, therefore, was not on sex or even on non-procreative sex. The taboo was on unsanctioned desire, on love that crossed class and gender lines in ways that threatened the patriarchal, hierarchical structure of Tokugawa society. In this kingdom, the same act could be a celebrated virtue or a capital crime, depending entirely on who you were. Victorian England, your desires were not sins, but symptoms of a disease. You are lying on a velvet-upholstered couch in a dimly lit London office. The air smells of leather-bound books and carbolic acid. The man standing over you is not a priest, but a doctor, his face a mask of detached clinical concern. He calls your feelings of anxiety, your bouts of melancholy, and your unladylike passions by a single, damning name: hysteria. The cure, he explains in a calm, authoritative voice, is a pelvic massage to induce a hysterical paroxysm. He assures you this is a purely medical procedure, devoid of any sordid implications. As he begins the manual treatment, you feel a wave of profound, disorienting shame. You are not being punished for a sin, but being treated for a madness your society invented to explain your own womanhood. The Victorian era, 1837 to 1901, was a period of staggering contradictions, a society publicly obsessed with propriety, piety, and progress while privately wrestling with the very forces it sought to suppress. In this kingdom, sexual taboos were medicalized, transformed from moral failings into pathological conditions. The burgeoning fields of medicine and psychiatry became the new arbiters of sexual normalcy, and their diagnoses were often more terrifying than any religious condemnation. Female sexuality, in particular, was seen as a dangerously volatile force, a potential source of insanity that needed to be managed, controlled, and, if necessary, surgically corrected. The diagnosis of female hysteria became a catch-all for any behavior, from sexual desire to intellectual ambition, that deviated from the ideal of the passive, domestic angel in the house. The cures for this supposed ailment were chillingly invasive. The physician-assisted pelvic massage, designed to bring the patient to orgasm, the paroxysm, became a routine, if unacknowledged, part of medical practice. Doctors complained of the manual effort involved, a complaint that directly led to the invention of the first electromechanical vibrators in the 1880s, marketed as legitimate medical devices for home use to treat hysteria. For more severe cases, the treatments escalated. Oophorectomy, the surgical removal of the ovaries, was prescribed for everything from nymphomane mania to general rebelliousness. Clitoridectomy, though less common in Britain than in America, was also performed based on the theory that the clitoris was the root of female masturbation and nervous disorders. While women were being pathologized, men were being terrorized by a different medical phantom: the devastating effects of spermatic economy, masturbation, or self-abuse, was believed to be a catastrophic drain on a man's vital energy. An entire genre of pseudo-medical literature emerged, filled with lurid warnings that this solitary vice would lead to a horrifying list of ailments: blindness, epilepsy, insanity, impotence, and a general wasting away of the body. Respected physicians wrote gravely of the masturbator's physiognomy, with its sunken eyes, pale skin, and limp posture. This panic fueled a booming market for anti-masturbation devices, instruments of torture designed to enforce purity through pain. These contraptions ranged from the simple to the baroque. There were rings fitted with inward-facing metal spikes, designed to be worn on the penis at night. Any nocturnal erection would result in a painful awakening. There were elaborate genital cages, padlocked contraptions of leather and steel that made physical contact impossible. Some devices were even wired to electric alarms that would ring throughout the house if an erection occurred. Ensuring public humiliation as part of the cure for boys, parents were advised to tie their hands to the bedposts at night or to cauterize the urethra to make arousal agonizing. This was not seen as abuse, but as a desperate, loving attempt to save a son from a fate worse than death. The social consequence of this medicalized repression was a society drowning in anxiety and hypocrisy. Men frequented brothels in staggering numbers to avoid polluting their angelic wives with their base desires, leading to rampant venereal disease that was then brought home to the family. Women, taught that their own desires were a symptom of madness, experienced their own bodies as alien and dangerous territory. The doctor's office replaced the confessional as the site of sexual judgment, and the language of pathology replaced the language of sin. But the goal was the same: the absolute control of human sexuality by an unassailable authority. The Victorians didn't just punish sex, they diagnosed it, pathologized it, and tried to cure it out of existence. Puritan New England. Your neighbors, I was God's most vigilant spy. The wood of the pillory is rough against your neck and wrists, chafing your skin raw. You have been here since sunrise, and the afternoon sun is relentless. You cannot wipe the sweat from your eyes or shield your face. The market square is full. Some people stare with cold, righteous judgment. Others, your friends and neighbors just yesterday, now hurl rotten vegetables and insults. Your crime is stitched onto your clothes for all to see. A single damning letter is not just the public humiliation, the heat, the filth. It is the crushing weight of 1,000 eyes, the knowledge that your private, intimate failing has become a public spectacle, a sermon delivered in flesh and shame for the spiritual edification of the entire community. In the fledgling colonies of 17th century New England, the Puritans sought to build a city upon a hill, a new Jerusalem governed by God's law. This was not a society that tolerated a distinction between private life and public duty. The community was a single organism, and a sin committed by one member was a sickness that threatened the whole. Sexual transgression, therefore, was not merely a personal failing. It was a direct affront to God that could provoke his wrath upon the entire settlement in the form of failed crops, disease, or attacks from native tribes. The ultimate taboo was any sexual act outside the confines of procreative, marital intercourse, and the policing of this taboo was the collective responsibility of every man, woman, and child. The legal codes of colonies like the Massachusetts Bay Colony were based directly on Old Testament law, and they were brutally explicit. Adultery was a capital crime, punishable by death for both parties. Fornication, sex between unmarried individuals, was punished with public whipping, fines, or forced marriage. Sodomy and bestiality were also capital offenses. The infamous Scarlet Letter, immortalized by Nathaniel Hawthorne, but a very real punishment, was legislated in several colonies. A person convicted of adultery was forced to wear the letter as stitched onto their outer garments for the rest of their lives. Other letters were used for other crimes. B for blasphemy, D for drunkenness. This was a permanent, walking billboard of one's sin. The methods of surveillance were chillingly intimate. The community was small, houses were close, and privacy was a foreign concept. Neighbors were expected and legally required to report any sinful behavior they observed. This practice of holy watching turned every person into a potential informant. A couple's courtship was heavily scrutinized. Bundling, a practice where a courting couple was allowed to share a bed, fully clothed, often with a bundling board placed between them, was a fraught attempt to balance propriety with the realities of courtship in cold, small houses. But it was a practice born of necessity and fraught with temptation, leading to numerous premarital pregnancy cases that ended in the public shame of the meeting house. Imagine being brought before the magistrates. Your accusers are the people you share a pew with every Sunday. The evidence might be a neighbor who overheard a suspicious noise, a midwife who noted a suspiciously timed birth, or the testimony of a rejected suitor. The trial would be swift, held by the same religious elders who governed every other aspect of your life. If convicted of a non-capital offense like fornication, the punishment was a public ritual. You would be led to the town center and tied to the whipping post. The constable would administer the lashes, often 39, one less than the 40 believed to be fatal, on your bare back, in full view of the entire town. Each lash was a physical reminder of God's law and the community's judgment. The social consequences extended far beyond the physical punishment. You and your family would be permanently stigmatized. The scarlet letter was a sentence to a lifetime of social isolation. Even after the whipping, your sin would be a part of your public identity, a story told and retold. This system was designed to maintain absolute social cohesion through fear and shame. There was no escape, no anonymity. Your moral ledger was a public record, and a single entry in the debit column could define the rest of your existence. It was a perfect surveillance state, one where the cameras were the eyes of your own neighbors and the database was the collective memory of the town. In this world, there were no private acts, only public sins waiting to be discovered. Imperial China, your body was mutilated to become a work of art. You're 5 years old. The room is dark, and the only sound is your mother's weeping as she binds your feet. She has already soaked them in a warm mixture of herbs and animal blood to soften them. Now, she curls your 4 smaller toes under the sole of your foot with such force that you feel the bones snap. The pain is a white-hot explosion, a scream trapped in your throat. Then she takes your big toe and heel, and with a long silk bandage, wrenches them together, breaking the arch of your foot. This is only the beginning. For the next 10 years, the bandages will be tightened, the bindings reapplied, your feet broken and rebroken, until they are no more than 3-inch, crescent-shaped golden lotuses. You are told this pain is the price of beauty, the price of a good marriage, the price of being a woman. During China's last imperial dynasties, particularly the Ming and Qing, Confucian ideals of social harmony and patriarchal order governed every facet of life. This order demanded a strict segregation of the sexes and the absolute subjugation of women. The most visceral and extreme manifestation of this ideology was the practice of foot binding. What began as a fashion among court dancers 1,000 years earlier had, by the Qing dynasty, become a near-universal practice among Han Chinese women of all but the lowest classes. The taboo was not on a sexual act, but on the natural form of the female body itself. To have large, natural, unbound feet was to be considered coarse, masculine, and sexually promiscuous, utterly unmarriageable for any family with social aspirations. The process was an act of ritualized, domestic torture, usually performed by the girl's own mother or grandmother. It was a brutal form of conditioning that began between the ages of 4 and 7, before the arch of the foot was fully developed. After breaking the bones, the feet were bound tightly with 10-foot-long silk or cotton strips. The bindings were changed every few days to prevent putrefaction, a process that involved scraping away dead skin and pus. The risk of infection was immense. If the toes rotted and fell off, it was often seen as a good thing, as it resulted in a smaller, more desirable foot. An estimated 10% of girls died from gangrene or other complications. The pain was constant, a lifelong agony that made walking and exercise an excruciating difficulty. This crippling mutilation was intensely and perversely eroticized by Chinese men. An entire subgenre of literature was devoted to the aesthetics of the bound foot. Men praised its smallness, its arch, its scent. The way a woman with bound feet walked, a tottering, swaying gait known as the lotus gait, was considered the epitome of feminine delicacy and helplessness. The foot itself became the ultimate erotic object, often kept hidden in tiny, exquisitely embroidered lotus shoes. In some erotic art, women are depicted completely nude except for these shoes. The taboo against a natural foot was so strong that a woman would never allow her bound feet to be seen bare, not even by her husband. They remained wrapped, a secret, malodorous symbol of her lifelong sacrifice to patriarchal ideals. The act of binding was a terrifying spectacle of domestic body horror. The girl screams were a normal part of the process. Mothers would often perform the binding in a secluded part of the house to muffle the sounds. They would tell their daughters that this agony was a demonstration of their love, the only way to secure them a future. It was a cycle of trauma passed from mother to daughter, a tradition enforced by women upon women to meet the demands of men. The physical result was a permanent disability. Women with bound feet could not work in the fields, run, or even walk long distances. They were prisoners in their own homes, their immobility a physical guarantee of their chastity and dependence. This practice was a perfect instrument of social and political control. It enforced the Confucian ideal of female confinement, making women literally incapable of straying. It was a visible class marker. The ability to afford a wife who could not perform manual labor was a sign of wealth. Most profoundly, it inscribed the patriarchal power structure directly onto the female body in a way that was permanent and irreversible. The taboo was so powerful that when Manchu rulers of the Qing dynasty tried to ban the practice, they failed. Han Chinese families continued it in secret as an act of ethnic and cultural defiance, clinging to the very symbol of their women's subjugation. Nazi Germany. Your desire was a threat to the purity of the master race. The light in the interrogation room is a single, bare bulb, swinging slightly and casting long, dancing shadows. The man across the table is not a priest or a judge. He is an SS officer, and his uniform is immaculately pressed. He does not shout. His voice is calm, almost bureaucratic, as he reads from the file in front of him. It is your life, cataloged by the state. The bars you visited, the letters you wrote, the name of your former lover who is now in a concentration camp. He pushes a piece of paper towards you. It is a confession and a voluntary application for castration. He explains, with chilling reasonableness, that this is not a punishment, but a therapeutic measure, a cure for your unnatural urges that will allow you to be a productive, if partial, member of the new Reich. The choice is yours. Sign the paper, or take the train to Dachau. In the totalitarian nightmare of Nazi Germany, sexuality was not a private matter. It was a core component of state ideology. The ultimate goal of the Nazi regime was the creation and purification of the Aryan master race, and every aspect of life, including sex, was marshaled to serve this end. The taboos were racial and eugenic. The 1935 Nuremberg laws criminalized marriage and sexual relations between Germans and Jews, branding it Rassenschande or race defilement. This was the paramount sexual crime, a biological treason against the German people, punishable by imprisonment and ultimately death. But the Nazi obsession with purity extended beyond anti-Semitism, creating a meticulously policed hierarchy of acceptable and unacceptable desires. Homosexuality was viewed as a direct threat to this project. It was seen as a contagious vice that weakened the nation, wasted Germanic seed, and eroded the masculine virtues necessary for soldiers and fathers. In 1935, the Nazis strengthened paragraph 175, a pre-existing law criminalizing male homosexuality. The new version was far more sweeping, allowing for the prosecution of men based on a mere kiss, an embrace, or even homosexual fantasies expressed in letters. A special branch of the Gestapo was formed to create vast registries of suspected homosexuals, using a network of spies and informants. An accusation was enough to ruin a life, leading to immediate arrest and interrogation. The process was one of systematic dehumanization. Once arrested, a man suspected of violating paragraph 175 was subjected to brutal interrogations designed to force a confession and the names of other homosexuals. He would then be sent to a prison or, more often, a concentration camp. In the camps, men accused of homosexuality were forced to wear a pink triangle, Rosa Winkle, a badge that marked them for particularly sadistic treatment from both the SS guards and their fellow prisoners. They were assigned to the most brutal work details, subjected to medical experimentation, and often tortured and killed. The Pink Triangle prisoners had one of the highest mortality rates in the camps. For those not immediately sent to the camps, the state offered a horrific choice: voluntary castration. This was presented as a medical cure for their perversion, Doctors and jurists argued that castration would rechannel a man's deviant urges, making him a docile, asexual, and therefore harmless member of society. Men were coerced into signing the consent forms under the threat of indefinite imprisonment in a concentration camp. The procedure itself was often performed crudely, leading to infection, complications, and profound psychological trauma. It was the ultimate expression of the Nazi state's power, the right to physically unsex a man in the name of ideological purity. The social and political machine was all-encompassing. Propaganda films depicted homosexuals as predatory, effeminate parasites corrupting German youth. Lesbianism, while not explicitly illegal in the same way, was condemned as a rejection of a woman's sacred duty to bear children for the Reich. Women deemed asocial, including lesbians, prostitutes, and nonconformists, could be arrested and sent to camps like Ravensbrück. The goal was total control over the nation's reproductive and erotic life, channeling all sexual energy towards the singular goal of breeding a pure Aryan race and eliminating any desire that did not serve that purpose. This was the ultimate taboo, a desire that did not conform to the genocidal vision of the state. That locked door in your mind feels so fragile now, doesn't it? The ghosts of these laws, these medical theories, these public shamings still echo in our modern world, in the language we use and the prejudices we harbor. In our next investigation, we will uncover the chilling story of how a single, forbidden book became the most dangerous object in the world, and the lengths kingdoms would go to burn every last copy and every last reader.